How conscription will work. Conscription, in one form or another, has been utilized by nations to fill the ranks of their armed forces since way back in history. And though highly controversial, it is a practice that continues to this very day. In the ongoing conflict between Ukraine and Russia, both sides have utilized conscription to bolster their numbers. In Ukraine, laws were enacted to require all men aged 18 through 60 to register for conscription, though only those aged 27 to 60 were initially liable to be called up for service. In the face of recent losses, this age was lowered to 25 in early 2024. Women with medical training are also required to register, though there's no requirement to serve. But everyone with medical qualifications can expect to be called up to serve in a national emergency. On the opposing side, Russia has also resorted to conscription in a law that went into effect on January 1, 2024. All Russian men aged 18 to 30 are required to serve for a year in Russia's armed forces, an increase from the original age limit of 27. As of July 2024, about 150,000 men have been drafted in this way. According to Russian law, these men are not to be sent outside of Russia, therefore freeing up other professional units for frontline service, though there were some that were sent to Ukraine, allegedly by mistake. There are other reported violations of this policy, but these are difficult to confirm or debunk. These policies are controversial, to say the least, with both sides seeing a large exodus of men of military age leaving their country. In Ukraine, a recent poll revealed that draft dodging was acceptable, according to 46% of the respondents, and a quarter were unsure. In Russia, it's a felony to leave the country after being summoned for service. In spite of the unpopularity of the practice, both sides will no doubt continue to rely on conscription to fill their ranks until the end of the conflict. As mentioned earlier, conscription is nothing new, with forms of it originating back to ancient times, and it's been used for millennia by virtually every major world power ever since. During the First and Second World Wars, participating countries experienced severe numbers of casualties among their servicemen, which forced them to implement strict measures to fill their rank. When there were not enough men willing to serve voluntarily, they resorted to conscription. After the world wars were over, the desperate need for soldiers was gone, though many nations still turned to compulsory military service, and the lingering fear of the draft hangs over the heads of many to this day. Nations around the planet still require their citizens, usually men, to perform military service, whether they wish to or not. Around 85 countries have some form of compulsory service. In some cases, it's a response to the ever-looming threat of war, such as in South Korea, which requires all able-bodied men aged 18 to 36 to undergo military training as a defense against their northern neighbor. For other nations, it's a matter of national security, even when there's no specific threat. Switzerland has conscripted its male population since 1848 and continues to do so today, though they've not actually participated in a war in centuries. Surprisingly, this is actually a popular policy and a major source of Swiss pride and national identity. In 2013, a referendum to eliminate compulsory service failed, with over 73% of the population in favor of keeping the system. After the Second World War, the United Kingdom continued the practice of conscription in order to ensure enough manpower for their military, which was needed in places like occupied Germany, the Middle East, and India. In 1947, Parliament passed the National Service Act. This required all physically able men between the ages of 17 and 21 to serve in the military for 18 months, though this could be deferred by university students and apprentices. After this service, they would be placed in the reserves for 4 years. In total, around 2 million men were conscripted this way until the new law was repealed in 1960, though those with deferments still had to serve. The last national servicemen were discharged in 1963. Training lasted for 6 weeks, with emphasis placed on training the men as quickly as possible. Accommodations could vary, but were generally of a lower standard, and the pay for the conscripts was a fraction of what the average British man would earn in the era. For the most part, after training, these men were sent to garrisons around the world. These could be relatively peaceful sectors, such as Germany, but could also be in active war zones, such as Cyprus, the Malayan emergency, and the Suez Canal crisis. In 1950, the North Koreans launched an invasion of their southern neighbors, and British troops were part of the UN force sent to intervene. As a result of Britain's involvement in the Korean War, the length of service was extended from 18 months to 2 years. In total, 395 British national servicemen were killed in action in various war zones throughout the world from 1947 to 1963, and many more injured. After the Second World War, the United States also maintained a system of conscription, commonly called the draft. The Selective Training and Service Act, which conscripted millions of men during the Second World War, was set to expire in 1947, though Congress, at the urging of Harry Truman, renewed the law in 1948. This was a temporary measure which would expire in 1950, though this was postponed due to the outbreak of the Korean War. 1.5 million men were drafted to fight in the conflict, with another 1.5 million sent to serve in occupation duties in Europe and Asia. Between 1954 and 1961, one of these men was perhaps the most famous entertainer in the world at the time, Elvis Presley, who served between 1958 and 1960 and was part of the 3rd Armored Division in West Germany. With their increasing involvement in Vietnam, the U.S. once again called upon the Selective Service System to ensure they had enough manpower to fight in the conflict. In an attempt to maintain some degree of equality, a lottery would be held in which birth dates and numbers would be chosen at random, in full view of government officials, observers, and the media to ensure transparency. If a man's number was called, he would be drafted into the armed forces. There were some deferments due to status, such as being a university student, medical issues, or a family situation. Though it was as fair as possible, since the numbers were assigned by random chance, the draft was deeply unpopular, and anti-draft protests were the cornerstone of the ever-growing anti-war movement that gripped the nation as the war dragged on. By the end of America's involvement in the conflict, 17,671 draftees had been killed in the conflict, about 30% of the total number of losses. The draft was so unpopular and had such an effect on public consciousness that, in spite of the numerous conflicts the U.S. had engaged in since Vietnam, these were all fought by volunteers. In spite of maintaining an all-volunteer force, the U.S. still maintains the Selective Service System, requiring all men aged 18 to 26 to register for a draft should the need arise. Though compulsory military service has been implemented in some form or another since ancient times, its practicality is hotly debated. Those in favor of conscription believe that it not only provides necessary manpower in times of national emergency, but also fosters a sense of patriotism, duty, and purpose for those called up, and instills much-needed discipline into a person's much-needed discipline into a person's life. It's believed that the lessons learned in the military will carry over to civilian life, improving the long-term prospects of both the conscript and the nation as a whole, well after service ends. For those opposed There's an argument that it is immoral to force someone to serve against their will, compelling them to risk their lives as well as grievous bodily harm and psychological trauma for a cause they do not believe in. There's also a practical concern. Those who are forced to fight against their will are obviously unmotivated and not committed to the cause. Their mindset, a potential liability in a combat zone. No one wants to share a foxhole with someone who is only there under duress. In the words of a Ukrainian soldier in the recent conflict, quote, "We still want people to join voluntarily because there's a big difference between someone who was drafted into the army and someone who went to defend their homeland. The desire to fight the enemy is very important, in addition to training, equipment, and preparedness." End quote. Draftees throughout history have served with distinction and bravery, and some have gone above and beyond the call of duty. In spite of this, calling up the unwilling to serve is a controversial practice. In the current unstable geopolitical climate, there are fears that wide-scale conflicts can break out, forcing nations to resort to conscription of their citizens. Whether this is an unfounded fear or a potential reality, what is certain is that fears of the draft will loom large in the minds of many around the world.